My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm the academic director here at the Karsh Institute of Democracy. We are so grateful for you all coming out. I know it's a very busy time of year, but we're thrilled to be able to host this conversation here as part of a broader series of conversations about the 2024 elections in the United States and globally. Stay tuned for many other programs, especially next fall. I personally believe that in many ways the future of global democracy will hang in many ways on what happens in Africa specifically, a region that has long been at the intersection of many different global currents, but is at a moment of inflection in many cases, and we'll be hearing about that today. And in particular, for those of you watching the international news, the story of what unfolded in Senegal over the past few months, where a kind of attempt to move towards a more authoritarian structure was successfully defeated, in no small part thanks to the work of Felwine Sarr and many of his colleagues in Senegal, is an inspiration, I think, and something that we can all learn from in this country and around the world. So we're particularly lucky to have two thinkers with us today who are tremendously influential, brilliant minds who've been shaping our discussions about Africa and the world for decades. And to have them think with us about the way they're reimagining, defending, and nourishing democracy in Africa and beyond. Achille Mbembe, I'm sure is known to many of you. He's at Wits University in South Africa, globally recognized as one of the major theorists of the 20th century, recently recognized with a Holberg Prize, 2024 Holberg Prize, which awards a lifetime of influential work in the humanities and social sciences. Congratulations. Among his best-known works in the U.S. are On the Post-Colony, more recently Critique of Black Reason, and a host of other essays. He's also a frequent contributor through interviews and discussions in newspapers throughout the world. He's also the creator and director of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, a major project that is setting up laboratories across the continent and thinking about how to nurture the future of democracy. And he'll be speaking about that today. Felwine Sarr is an economist, philosopher, writer, and musician, although I reversed the order. He was a musician first, and all the others have been to come.
You're right.
The author of Afrotopia and 11 other books and 2 edited collections, the latest of which just arrived in a box at his house yesterday. It's called Le Bouddhisme est né à Koloban. So a prolific, also a writer of theater, and kind of a major cultural force in Senegal. The two of them set up something called Les Ateliers de la Pensée, the workshops of thought, that has really animated conversations for the past years in Senegal. And in the last 2 years, Felwine has moved to Duke University from Senegal, where he was dean at the University of Saint Louis, to take up the Anne-Marie Bryant Distinguished Professor of French and Francophone Studies, where he teaches now. And he has been playing a really central role in defending democratic institutions in Senegal. In 2022, he was one of the first to call attention to the dangerous moves that were being made by then President Macky Sall to kind of argue for an extension of his mandate, which was against the Constitution. And as the crisis developed over the past 2 years, he's been writing consistently about this problem, but more recently organized university faculty and legal thinkers to kind of to resist this. He's helped to found the Collectif des Universitaires pour la Démocratie, which will continue to be active in Senegal. So thank you both for your work and for being with us today.
Thank you.
Our conversation is moderated by our very own Emily Burrill, who we're delighted to have here as a faculty member in history and in the Karsh Institute, a specialist on Mali and West Africa, on the history of law and gender and democracy. And we're so grateful you can guide us. So I'm handing it over to Emily. She will have a guided conversation with the two of them for about 35-40 minutes. Then there'll be time for conversation. We are filming this. It's not being live streamed, but we'll film it and make it available afterwards for those who were not able to attend. So thank you all for coming in. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, I want to echo Laurent's thanks to all of you for coming and being here, and thank you so much to our esteemed guests who are with us. So I thought I would start by asking a question about the present moment that we are in. This is something that Laurent just alluded to. I want us to talk a little bit about what is unfolding right now and what has just unfolded in Senegal with regard to the presidential elections and what they might tell us about democratic movements, crises, resilience, questions, as they emerged in Senegal specifically, but maybe what the lessons of Senegal might hold for those of us who have questions about democracy in the moment we're in. So, Felwine, the last time you were here, we were having a discussion last year about what was happening in Senegal with the presidential elections. We had no idea. There was no crystal ball for us to look into to see the moment we've just had with the elections. Things were very uncertain. Opposition candidates were still in prison. We did not know who would be on the final approved ballot. Could you tell us a little bit about what has just happened in Senegal and what you think are some of the most important takeaways that we can draw from the election process?
So thank you, Emily. I would like to start by saying hello to everyone and saying that I'm very happy to be here, the second time in 1 year. So Laurent is very efficient. and I'm very happy to be in conversation with Achille around this topic. And I think also Achille has something to say about Senegal, because I heard a TV interview he gave a week ago, and he was very insightful about the situation of Senegal. So when I came here last year, we were in a very difficult time. So, as you say, the main political party of the opposition was dissolved by a decree of the president. The main leaders were imprisoned, and there was also a kind of restriction of the civil space of expression in Senegal. The demonstrations were frequently, prohibited. A lot of people went in jail for their opinions. So, and we had episodes of violence with people killed by the police, and we didn't know where we were heading. Senegal was a kind of a mirror, a vitrine, a so-called vitrine of democracy in Senegal. But at that time, the vitrine cracked in various places, and we ended up in the 24th of March having at least the elections with a candidate that was not supposed to be the candidate, but was a kind of substitution of the original one. And the Senegalese, after long episodes, of fighting against the regime that wanted first to postpone the election by just stopping the electoral process in February 3, with a law that was extending his term until December. And the Constitutional Court intervened by saying to the president that he didn't have the right to do that, asked him to just choose a new date for the presidential election. He didn't do that simply, and the Constitutional Court came twice to force the president to choose a date within his legal term, and we ended up in March 24 having the election, and the Senegalese vote for the opposition at the first round, I would say massively and clearly, and choose a change or a third alternation. And I would call it a democratic revolution. And I think the two terms are important for me. It's a democratic turn because we were very fear of the diverse possibilities we didn't know. So this change has arrived with the vote in the ballot box, and I would call it a revolution or a desire of revolution, or a revolution that is knocking on the door. So a desire of changing the structure, the political structure, the economic structure, and the relation with the rest of the world. So I think there is a lot of lessons that can be drawn. First of all, is that the idea of democracy, or the imaginary, or the attachment to democracy is rooted in the Senegalese society. Even though we had our crises and our limitations and our vulnerabilities, so they exist and sometimes they are strong. But the idea that at least the people of Senegal have to choose by voting what they want, which type of regime, they have to choose who must rule the country, on which kind of question, and they have to choose, and their sovereignty, this idea that they have to be the one who decide and configure their fate and be the one who decide. I think it's an idea that is deeply rooted. And even though during the crisis some demonstration fails because of the repressions, and some people were arguing that the ruling party was gaining with the battle, I think a lot of Senegalese has the sense that they were waiting the day of the election to just express themselves. And they have the last word of what was happening, and it was their vote. And the reading that they just left the space to the regime was not a right reading of the question. They were convinced that they have the ability to change things by voting. And I think it's an important lesson to draw from Senegal. The institution, the civil society, the different actors that play a role also choose that sometimes the fate of the nation is played in the space of the political power, but also this political power is disseminated within the society, and the society is a stakeholder of an important proportion of the political power. And I think it's also a lesson that the political power was in the street, in the demonstration, was in the civil society, was in the lawyers' hand when the lawyers fought against the judicial system, was in the hand of the academics and the scholars and the journalists and a variety of types of actors that play their role, and they were convinced that they can face the situation, even though the coercive force was with the power, but they believe that the action they were taking in the intellectual space, in the space of the discussion, in the space of the demonstration, in different space, in the space of law and justice, were action to be taken because they could become productive. And I think it's also a lesson that the society knew that they have the means to change things, and they believe in those means. And I think it's an important lesson. So they didn't give up, and they fought every steps. So even though the main opponent, the main political party was dissolved, they find a way to still being part of the conversation, even though being illegal, even though the main opponent figure were in jail, they find a way to substitute him by another figure. Even though the election was stopped, they find a way to push with the Constitutional Court to bring back the election. And the day of the election, they decide that it will be one term, not two terms, one tour, and they make a useful vote, what we call in French, un vote utile, and they decide just to change and to express it clearly. And I think there's much more to be said, but I will leave it for now here.
Yeah, I think that's really useful, and I just want to apologize to everyone for the coughing. I'm so sorry. I promise you can't catch anything from me. So one of the things that I draw from what you've just said to us, Felwine, is the important relationship between law, structural process, institutions, in this particular case, the judiciary in Senegal, and constitutionality, and belief that constitutions matter, but constitutions are also the terrain on which we might debate what rule of law and what democracy should look like. On the other hand, we also have this important, long-standing and complicated social forms of democracy in Senegal that we see animating different kinds of debate, discussion, protest was really important in the case of Senegal. And so this is this very dynamic relationship between the creation of durable, sometimes fragile structures of democracy, and also the will of the people and the way that things move and work on the ground. This is something I think, Achille Mbembe, when I think about what you've written about in the past, and please feel free to comment on the current Senegalese situation as well. I was wondering if, in turning to you, if you wanted to comment on that dynamic interplay between institutions and structures of democracy, especially constitutions, and what we think of them, and how they interplay and relate to democratic formation on the ground, something you've called communities of life in different contexts that you've written about. that's a mouthful to throw in your direction. Maybe you want to start by talking a little bit about what happened in Senegal and comment on what Felwine Sarr has just said.
Yes, of course, I'm tempted to comment on what has happened
Follow your
in
temptation.
Senegal because to some extent I'm a Senegalese too. In fact, I hold a Senegalese passport.
Absolutely.
Of which I'm so proud of. But Felwine, I think he gave us a rather exhaustive account of what has been going on there from a position of, I would say, privilege, because he was deeply involved in helping us to understand what was at stake at a time when, seen from outside, things didn't look that clear. And for that capacity for reading the times, many of us are, of course, very grateful to him. The fact is that there's a continental public sphere that has been growing over, I would say, the last 15, 20 years. Continental public sphere in the sense that things happening in one country are observed and commented upon, call for engagement from people from all other countries. So, including from South Africa, you have comments on what's going on in Senegal. So when the Sahelian region was undergoing a number of coups d'etat this year or last year, this was a matter of continental concern. I would like to highlight that phenomenon because I think that the emergence of this and consolidation of this continental public sphere is a very good thing for those of us who are involved in the business of re-enchanting the democratic project. I say re-enchanting the democratic project because, as we know very well, democracy is under siege almost everywhere. I guess including here too, in Europe, of course, but very importantly in Africa. But as Laurent was suggesting, it might well be that some of the most important innovations going on right now in terms of redesigning democracy, some of them are happening in the continent. And as we just heard from Felwine, Senegal has been a key laboratory for these innovations, not just now, but over a very, very long term. And that history, of course, is something we have to pay attention to. So that's the first thing, if you want. The second point has to do with constitutionalism, which you mentioned. I mean, I have been spending a lot of my time of late going to West Africa, Senegal in particular, but also other parts of the region in the context of the work for the foundation Laurent mentioned. It's amazing the level of the debate that has gone on in Senegal on the constitution. What it does allow, what it doesn't allow, how to interpret it, and how to reinterpret the law. To the point where, I mean, you are in a bus and people are debating the fine items of the constitutions. Yes, this article says this. Oh yes, but you didn't read the line number 10. There's a big debate on law and how law can be reinvented in order precisely to meet what should always be its main horizon, which is justice. not legality as such, but matters of justice. Matters of justice in the face of massive violations of, let's say, justice principles in an everyday, on an everyday basis. So it seems to me that that's really important, and in the kind of work Felwine was involved in prior to the elections, I mean, he ran these long series of interviews with scholars. A lot of them were lawyers. And we see that activism, juridical activism, going on, including in places such as South Africa, where the judiciary has been playing a key role in upholding democracy. A little, and I'll end there, little difference with Senegal, the importance of the business sector and people with money. My own view is that if democracy in places such as South Africa is still holding on 30 years later today, and I mean, it's still really vibrant. It's a vibrant democratic system. Although the ANC has reached an end of a cycle, it's partly also because of the strength of the private sector. And therefore, there is a need for a deep reflection precisely on those connections between the kind of economic model which we have in place and the political reforms, democratic reforms, a number of our countries are undertaking. All of that with the view, of course, of consolidating a civil society we cannot really think of without the forces of money, the forces that control the means of production. So these are rather broad observations, but I think they build on what Felwine has shared with us and help hopefully to expand our conversation.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I might turn our attention to, I'm going to press us to move back in time because I'm a historian, but also because you both are you're both pointing towards dynamics that you're seeing as very active on the ground regarding active, vibrant social engagements with democracy. Achille, you were just talking about the importance of capital and finance in a contemporary moment. Talk to us a little bit about what are the important transformations we need to look to in the recent past that help explain where we are now. Both of you have written about the past to a certain degree. I would say, I think of you, Achille Mbembe, as someone who's been concerned with very pressing questions about colonialism, certainly, about the formation of sort of blackness in relationship to Europe, necropolitics, and what that means in the history of this. Can you say a little bit about the history of certain democratic processes that you think we should be paying attention to on the continent and what the lessons are for us today? That may be too open a question, but I want to hear where you take some of those responses.
I'll start and then Felwine will.
No, it's okay.
Look, I mean, where to look for the first macro process,
Yeah.
which is just unfolding, the full consequences of which we haven't seen yet. It has to do with the demographic shift, which is actually going on in the continent. The demographic shift in the sense that the continent, as I speak, is mostly inhabited by young people. And when I say young people, I really mean young people. I don't mean people like us. or even people like Laurent, who's younger than me. But I really mean young people. Felwine has some of the latest figures. When we take a place like Senegal, he will probably share them. But the key challenge is to reform societies and build or redesign democracies which take very seriously this demographic challenge. So the demographics of democracy, that's what I'm talking about. It has never really been experimented historically. There's not one single country in the world in modern history that has had to develop democracy while the majority of the population was composed of young people. That's our historical challenge in Africa. How we address it and what forms of innovations this requires is in itself a very exciting both intellectual, cultural, and artistic, ethical project. So that's the first, if you ask me, that's the first thing I have to look into. The second one has to do with, let's just call it, the changing mental and cultural structures. By this I mean the huge aspiration throughout the continent for an authentic decolonization. Mm-hmm. Decolonization of institutions, decolonization of forms of life, decolonization of the economy. There's a huge surge of interest in relation to what it would mean for Africa to stand on her own legs and shoulder her own responsibility in relation to a planet which is itself in crisis. So this issue of decolonization and the search for new forms of sovereignty, I see it as not an accidental trend, but as a structural trend which will have a huge impact in the future on how people become either citizens or just social and historical actors. The last thing I would look at very, very carefully has to do, of course, with the limits of electoral politics, electoral democracy. The big demand, the big question many young people we are working with are confronting today is whether or not it is possible to achieve the kind of radical transformation of their lives they are aspiring to through the ballot box. Whether it's possible to do it through the ballot box or whether it should be done through the fire, to use a term young South Africans use a lot. The challenge is, the choice is between the ballot box. If it can be done through the ballot box, we'll do it next time the fire. Sense of Baldwin talks about it. So it seems to me that's a very serious conundrum, whether this can be done, under what conditions, which means whether liberal forms of democracy are still possible in a context, in a neoliberal context, in a context of an economy that is deeply extractive, in a context in which it's an economy, a political economy that is premised very often on predation rather than production. So it seems to me these are three, let's say, huge trends. One has to pay attention to very, very carefully if we want to say anything meaningful about our contemporary predicament. But I guess it's not just an African predicament.
Right.
I think it's a planetary predicament, especially if we connect it to the ecological crisis we are facing right now as humanity at large. So that's what I would say.
That's right. And so there's a lot there for us to unpack. Felwine, I didn't know if you wanted to respond
Yes.
to anything that just came up.
Yes, I want to build on some Achille's point. I think the question of the demography is a very important one. In Senegal, actually, the population, more than 70% of the population is under 30. And if you take out the kids who are between 1 year and 15 years, they are 49% of the population. So it's a huge structural change of the democratic architecture of the country, and it means something that is important. But I want to just reflect on the constitution first. I think thinking on the present times is also unfolding the different temporalities that are in the present. So it's unfolding the past that led us here, but it's also opening ways to the future. And the present time is a time where those traces of those temporalities are here, are activated or not differently. And just the constitution, we fought in 2012 against Abdoulaye Wade's desire to have a third term. And I think the debate in Senegal around the constitution began really in 2012. Most of the time, one of the criticisms was to say that African constitutions are imported from the Western countries, so they don't reflect the African aspiration to live together. What is in part true, but just in part. If you look at the history of all the constitutions, they were imported. And through the historical time and the political crisis of the country, so they were changed, adapt, and they became a result of a political history of a given country or nation. But at their origin, they were copied from elsewhere. And in 1962, we had a crisis in Senegal between President Senghor and Mamadou Dia, a crisis of bicephaly. So there were two important figures of the executive. And after that, the Senegalese constitution was changed to give more power to the president. So it became a presidential regime. And we say actually a hyper presidential regime after this crisis. So this crisis changed the political regime from a more parliamentary to a presidential one. And we had few referendum to change, some articles, but those referendum, so there are traces of what was happening in the political history. In 2012, so this fought, Abdoulaye Wade managed to present himself because the Constitutional Court didn't declare illegal, his attempt for a third term. But in the vote, the Senegalese society decided to stop the term to 2. And we thought at the time that this question was solved because when the President Macky Sall arrived, he organized a referendum to lock this article that was limiting the mandate, the presidential mandate to 2. And his argument was, I'm locking this article so for eternity, so no one could have more than 2 terms. And we had to fight again his desire to run for a third mandate. And I think it took us 24 years to solve this question of the 2 term in Senegal. And now I'm sure that it's finished, that no one will, attempt for a third term because we did it twice. And what I want to say by taking this example is that the appropriation of the Constitution is a historical process. And it's a process that is built through crisis. And it's because we had a crisis that we were interested in what the Constitution says and what are the rights of the citizen and how can we stop the excess of the executive power, what are the power of the citizen, the right of demonstration is in the Constitution, but it was not respect. And all these questions, they just pop up because of the crisis. If we weren't in crisis, I don't think that we would look very carefully what the Constitution allows us, and this process of appropriation of the Constitution and debating in the public spheres, in the in the buses, in the place where people take tea, and everyone became an expert of the articles of the laws. But this article say, I think it was a very interesting process, and it go against the idea that this Constitution came from the Constitution of the Fifth Republic of France, so it's not our constitutions. And it goes beyond, and it complicates the debate between what is universalism as principles and what is idiosyncratic, what came from the political history of Senegal, and how we can mix this and find a way to find ourselves and our aspiration in a kind of, and I think this historical process is also interesting, and I think the Constitution of South Africa, post-apartheid, is also an interesting take, so we can look how the society redefine itself after a long crisis of equality, of justice, of discrimination, and what does it mean to look how the Constitution unfolds and become the place where we negotiate how do we want to live as a society, and what does it mean, and what are the deep questions. The second point I wanted to highlight is probably this desire of completing the decolonization by completing this process in the epistemologic space, in the economic space. The question of economic sovereignty is an important one, with this feeling that we are subject of extractivism, and in the international, I would say, transaction economic, we are the one who are having the lower part, and this part is not fair. And I think there is a desire of renegotiating the morality of the presence of African societies in the global world, and in a more fair way in all the dimensions, in the political dimension, in the economic. But I think also there's a desire of producing new forms of life, of political life, of economic life, of social life, etc., etc. And the last point is that I totally agree with the idea that democracy is not just procedures, it's not just forms, it's something deeper than that. You know, it's the ability to be able to share, to build a social contract that we share the well-being within the society. The ability to base the movement of the society on what the society has the best to offer. So collective intelligence, more than, etc., etc. The ability to build a counter power to limit the hubris or the excess of the power. The ability to have space of deliberation. And to go toward what Achille called a substantive democracy. So the ability of building a political subject and a citizen that is a subject of law, that has rights, that is a subject of care, etc., etc. So to go deeper. But also I'm noticing that in a lot of African countries, when I was thinking about recently what the Togolese president has taken as a decision, and in some spaces, I would say in Benin or Burkina Faso, etc., etc., there is a desire that the process are really fair process, and the desire to be able to free the process from the capture of the executive or the politics. They are always capturing the electoral process and trying to make it say what it doesn't say, and trying to make the process not reflect the desire of the people. And I think there is here a challenge to put in place processes that reflect what the people want. In Senegal, we were in some thought that we have a good electoral process, so if people vote, change will happen. But also we were feared that the electoral process, become a capture by the actual government. Fortunately, the election went well, and no claims, even from the government, right? And it allowed the Constitutional Court to declare very quickly the official result, and to organize, the transmission of the power. But I think in a lot of places, how the process are captured is a question, and it's a technical question, but it's also an important question to deal with.
Okay. So it's interesting when I think about the conversation that we're having here. We've been toggling back and forth, we've been toggling back and forth between turn to the ballot box, turn to the Constitution, move beyond the ballot box, move beyond electoral processes, build sustainable democratic cultures, think about the nation state, let's move beyond the nation state. I mean, so one of the things that seems to be on the table here is thinking about, how we can approach democratic formations in African contexts on multiple levels. look to the past for how we might think about how we've arrived, where we're at, diagnosing the present moment. Both of you have done a very, very astute, complicated work on that front. And as we move towards the sort of the end of the more formal part of our discussion, and then open up the ground for Q&A, can both of you say a little bit about how you're taking some of these ideas that have animated the discussion just now in the work that you're doing right now on building organizations, supporting organizations and community work in different African contexts to sustain democratic values that you think are important? Maybe, Felwine, if I can turn back to you.
Achille
You want to
first.
go to Achille? Achille Mbembe. You want to say a little bit about the work you're doing right now with your institution?
Look, I mean, what I can say is that the moment we live in is really exciting. Felwine and I, in 2016, we did set up in Dakar an intellectual platform called Les Ateliers de la Pensée, which aimed at bringing together the best of what African intellectuals have been producing. When I say intellectuals, artists, on that, creating a space where we would meet and reflect collectively, not only about the predicament of our continent, but also the state of the world, how to read the world from the continent. The continent having been read from above the world for too long. How do we shift the perspective in order to achieve a certain level of fairness in these broader economy of intellectual exchanges, if you want? We set this platform on, set it up, well before the whole decolonial movement gained in steam and the rest. But we also set it up as in the full knowledge that democracy, properly understood, is also about the care we bring to bear on the intellect, on intelligence, on our capacity to produce collective intelligence. So that platform is still going on, and it's part of precisely those experimentations we have unleashed, which attract a number of people. We are working on the next step. I know, but Felwine will talk about it. Felwine is also an editor. He has a printing press called Jimsan. And he was just telling me before we came here, I asked him, okay, what is on the program? What's coming out? He will talk about it. So this is an area also of production of intelligence, which is absolutely crucial for the democratic future of the continent. More directly, I have, over the last 2 years, with many others, Felwine has been helping Mamadou, a number of other intellectuals, Suleiman Bashir Diagne. We have set up an institution called the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. It is an institution which is funded by the French. And people ask me, but why is it that the French are funding the... I said, why shouldn't they be funding it? The Americans are funding efforts at democratizing the continent, the Germans. Why shouldn't they be funding? In fact, the problem is not that they are funding. They should give even more than they are giving now. They should, if only to repair the damage French African policy has done over so long. So the issue of who is funding, of course it's important. Of course Africans are first responsible to finance democracy in the continent, But in addition to that, I think in the politics of the world we're living in, others have to pay for it because they have been also responsible for the degradation of the conditions of governance in our country. Anyway, that's the polemical part of it, and I'm sure you understand that. The more substantive part has to do with what Felwine was trying to share during the last minutes of his last intervention. How do we build a democracy, a democratic culture in the continent that is cognizant of our deepest traditions, historical traditions, the historian? Because when we look into the history, political history of our societies, the histories of ideas in the longue durée of African life, of course there is a treasure there to tap into. So we are doing a lot of work in that direction. We have set up a consortium of universities in the continent which will introduce in their curriculum the teaching of democracy, which doesn't exist for the time being. Doesn't exist in any African university. There are thousands of African universities, none of which is teaching democracy as a subject. So we are building this consortium. We are launching this program in September in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Ivory Coast, Senegal, and Cameroon to start with. And then we'll see through collaborations with UVA and other places how we can disseminate and share the effort. We are investing a lot in response to the demographic challenge Felwine was talking about and the gender challenge, because these have been historically the three lines of cleavages: gender conflict, generational conflict, and class conflicts. In African history, these are the three, if you want, intersectional lines of cleavages. So we are trying to address each of them particularly. We are developing a whole set of programs on a project we call Le Matrimoine, the matrimony, just as you have le patrimoine, which is a huge intervention in the field of gender, encompassing a whole set of areas. So I'll stop there. The key thing is that it's impossible nowadays to, let's say, okay, I'm only doing theory. I'm not paying attention to praxis. That kind of division, we don't believe in it any longer. The moment is such that we need to bring together the realm of knowledge production and the realm of social and political intervention in a new structure that is open and that is building on the technologies that are available to us today, because we can do so many things we couldn't do early on. And this is the way in which we will be able to, let's say, animate the new social movements that are emerging throughout the continent. So, if you want, that's the agenda.
That is a substantial agenda that is very exciting. Felwine, is there something you have a lot to add?
Yes, I'll wrap up just quickly. I think the point about digging in the history of African societies, because most of the time we have the feeling of what I will call an institutional amnesia, as if before the encounters with the colonizer, African society didn't produce various forms of government. They produce forms of government and being together. And I was in the car with Laurent, and we were talking about the genealogy or the archaeology of the term democracy. And we say that we are convinced that without labeling it as democracy, in various parts of the world, Africa, Asia, forms of government that respect the subject, their dignity, they took care of them, existed in the historical time.
That's right.
So we can just free ourselves about the genealogy of democracy and think about the idea and the content. And if you think about the content, we can find resources, in different places of how people organize themselves, how they deliberate, how they took decisions, how they put at the center the dignity. I'm not saying that authoritarianism or dictatorship didn't exist in those places, but also I think these forms of deliberation exist. So probably there is something to say, to look there and to just consider them as resources of thought, imagination and imaginaries, to reinvent new forms of being together. And if you want to keep calling it democracy, it's fine, but I think much more important is what is the content and what is at the roots of those ideas. And I think there's a lot of resources need to be just taken and articulated for that.
Mm-hmm. This sounds like a strong argument for the humanities, if I may. Well, this is wonderful. I would like to turn to you all and take a few questions. If you have a question or something you want to add to the conversation, just please raise your hand and I'll call on you and I'll ask you to just say your name and pose your question. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions, maybe begin with you.
Thanks. Did you say?
Tell us what your name is and then.
I'm in the music department.
Excellent.
And I work in Central African and West African music and dance and politics. That's better. So I thought maybe I'd like to hear, when you were introducing Felwine, you mentioned that he's foremost musician. So to bring it back together, so how do you see music and dance practice, cultural practice, as feeding into this well of knowledge about democracy that it exists in Africa?
That's a great question.
Doesn't even have to be reinvented.
That's great. I'm going to take 1 or 2 more questions. So will you remember the questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Just right.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Quinn Jepson. Actually, I was a former fellow in the Democracy Institute a couple years ago. And my question is regarding democracy in the security state, especially in the Sahel. I think it's this question about constitutionality and the arguments about it in Senegal is so important and such a reason why Senegal's democracy has remained so strong. But in countries like Burkina Faso or Mali, where so many young people are being displaced by incredibly violent groups or societies and things like that, it's very difficult for me to make the argument to them that they should do government through civil society, through democracy, and not trust the military in that case. And I guess my question is, like, how can democracy survive as a form of governance in societies that are, engaging in such a serious emergency for security and internal displacement?
Yeah. Great. Great. Maybe 1 more question? Steve Ball.
Hi, my name is Steve Mull. I work as Vice Provost for Global Affairs here at UVA, and I want to thank you both for a really fascinating discussion. And speaking for the university, we're really excited to work, especially with your initiative, Achille. One of the big challenges that democracies face everywhere in the world is how do you find the right balance between community standards, the views and values of the many against the rights of the few. And in Africa, that seems to be a particularly current issue when you look at efforts to criminalize LGBT activity. How do you see that tension playing out in Africa going forward?
Okay, so you have been asked 3 very rich, different kinds of questions. Where do
I
I
will
begin?
take the music one, and
Excellent.
I will let to Achille the difficult one.
Okay. Excellent.
So I deeply think that music is a democratic space. In the classes I give at Duke, I have a class titled Music, History, and Politics in Contemporary Africa. And what I try to do is to draw a history of a post-colonial African state through the music as an epistemic archive, not just as a sensitivity or beauty, but knowing that we can learn a lot by listening to the music on the historical process, the political process, the cultural process. And I think also music is a space that Alain Badiou called a procedure of truth. Mm-hmm. It's an epistemic space when you have a band, so you have to discuss, to articulate, to share knowledge, to build something together with different histories. So the place of music are a place of democratic practice. Mm-hmm. So you can just come and say, okay, it's my idea, so we are going to... Mm-hmm. No, if you play with some people, you're involved in a democratic practice. And you have to articulate a story that is a story made by all the stories you have. And even though in dance, in a lot of performance, when you are on stage and you see some African dancing, what is interesting is that everyone know what to do, at what time intervene, at what time step back. So you have solos, but you have some choreography, and you have a kind of dialogue, and everyone find the right place. And it's very interesting when you are on stage and playing in a concert in the world, and when an African dancer came on stage, he knows how much time to dance, to interact, when to step back, and this kind of intelligence of playing his part in the story or in the narrative. And I think those practices are practices of trying to build something together and being able to articulate a kind of knowledge of how to contribute to something that is bigger than me and which is the just part of that. Mm. So I think, and the last example I would take about music is that I have a Congolese friend who is a film maker, and he was reflecting on what could bring together Congolese people, and he thought that the constitution was not the good place because that it wasn't appropriated by people extra. And he told me that music, if we have music as constitution in Congo, probably it would work. Mm-hmm. And probably around the Congolese music, all the Congolese will, find themselves around something. And I laugh at first stage, but after I reflect, I say, it's probably an interesting idea to create musical constitutions in some spaces. So I leave to Achille the difficult question of Mali. On the Mali, I can help you later if you just go together.
That's what I was
first.
Going to,
yes.
That's what I was going to plead for.
Yes.
Okay, these are really difficult ones. Starting with yours on the conundrum, democracy, security, which for the time being is the two terms are usually, at least in practice, the Sahel region, but also elsewhere, presented as antithetical, as if the choice was between either security or democracy. We give you security, but we keep democracy. We give you democracy, but the result is insecurity. So it seems to me that from an intellectual point of view, we have to find a way of getting out of that conundrum or apparent conundrum. The way to do that is not to discard security, because insecurity in its many different forms is a real issue, not only in the Sahel but elsewhere. Economic, spiritual too, terms of bodily integrity, capacity to hold on to the little people have, the access to the means of existence, which include all kinds of resources, including the resources for mobility. The fact that to stay alive, you have to be able to move. How do you move inside a continent which is still somewhat saddled by multiplicity of borders and impediments? All of that, it seems to me, is part of the overall package. So the way to get out of that apparent conundrum is to develop a concept or conception of security which is broader than just military security. Let's say human security. recover that notion of human security insofar as it encompasses matters of repair because so much is being damaged, not only through wars, but different forms of violence that are saturating the social, forms of care. How do we take care of not only bodies, but also minds? So a concept of human security that is far broader than just, let's say, putting money into the military. Second, we achieve this by reinforcing concretely intermediary in les institutions, la médiation. All those institutions that help to lessen the level of violence within the society, where people can negotiate. And that's where a return to some of our history is really important, because part of, when we look at pre-colonial Africa, one of the strengths of pre-colonial African forms of government was, first of all, the capacity to include everybody, that everybody has a place. Inequality was somewhat tolerated, but exclusion was not. Everybody, chacun a une place pour chacun, including for those who, anyway, the principle of having a space for everybody. Second, the development of mechanisms, cultural mechanisms to negotiate conflicts before they blow up into the open, as we see in places like Sudan right now. So what I'm saying is that security and democracy are not to be opposed. There are ways in which we have to think of them in one form, by building precisely on this idea of substantive democracy Felwine was referring to at the end of his talk. Now, very concretely, Vice Provost, we know what's going on in relation to, for instance, sexual minorities in the continent. In South Africa, things from a legal point of view are pretty fine. The law in South Africa guarantees rights to everybody without any discrimination. Practice something else, it can be improved. But we have places such as Uganda, Ghana recently, or Nigeria or Cameroon, where I was born, where you have laws that are really cruel laws when it comes to the protection of sexual minorities. And of course, we have to mobilize, and there are mobilizations going on already in that regard. The adoption of some of those laws over the last 10 years has been orchestrated, we have to say it, by very often international forces, number of churches that are really militating actively against the expansion of rights to sexual minorities in the continent. And of course, the building onto so-called African traditions, most of which are not really true because they are invented recently. In African pre-colonial societies, sexual freedom was something we haven't even begun to write properly about. That these are societies that are allowed for, just like in music, in singing or dancing, all forms were allowed. Everybody doing his or her little thing in a singular manner. So it seems to me indeed that we can really build on those intellectual, cultural resources to reimagine the social as inclusive, radically inclusive, as substantive in the sense that one dimension has to be measured against other dimensions, as open, which they have always been, and as plastic in the sense that they have this extraordinary capacity to put together things which apparently do not fit.
Yeah.
I mean, you go to some of our cities, that's what we do all the time. People putting together, assembling and reassembling and repairing every single thing that can be mobilized in the business of maintaining life. So that's what we have to do intellectually and politically, it seems to me. That's the challenge.
Yeah, I think that's right. Can I ask, how much time do we have? Do we have time for? Okay, there's the clock. Excellent. We have time for another round of questions. So just raise your hand if you have a question. So I think we'll start with you and then move into the back and then keep going. Sir, you had a question. Yeah.
Yes. My name is Ivan Marcos. I come from a university in Brazil. And thanks so much for such a thoughtful presentation, both. And my question concerns technology, the use of technology, and the use of Western technology in Africa. Because as you know, and I appreciated very much your comment that you don't believe in the separation of theory and practice. And we know that technology is not neutral. So when you use technology and we say, or when one says, we can do lots of things that we could not do, this we is very problematic. And also the things they don't come without hidden values and hidden history. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Okay, great. And then there's a question in the back. Sorry, Vivian, I'm going to make you move with the microphone.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Monique. So I have a question regarding the changing of the constitution in the African country. So usually when the election approaching, we see a president changing the constitution in order to extend the mandate. So what do you think, a scholar can do, or what the solution to that?
That's a great question. And I think we have time for one more question. There was a question over here. I'm pointing at you with glasses. Yeah, okay.
Hi, sorry, thanks for a great discussion. I wanted to ask you a little more about the sort of role that judiciaries play in democracy, because, for instance, in Senegal, you mentioned that the judiciary played an important part in moving past the constitutional crisis, but also as we've seen in democracies around the world, the judiciary also plays a role sometimes in hollowing out democracy. And I'm thinking of, say, the US, for instance, or even India, where the judiciary has just weakened democracy in various forms, whether it's overturning, Roe versus Wade in the US, and I just wanted to know a little more about what you think. A strong judiciary sounds great, but it can also play these kind of roles that work against democracy. So I just wanted to know more about that.
So you've got, okay, and one more question over here maybe, and you're going to have to be really
Brief.
The challenge is going to be brief, but it's always important to get the questions out, right? Jihan.
Hi, thank you. It's working. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Jihan. I am a grad student from the American University in Cairo. And actually, I have two questions. The first one about the decolonization. I think it's very important to apply the decolonization in the whole aspects in our societies, in Africa and all countries. But how we can do this and we still have corrupted regimes and dictatorial presidents. I can mention Sisi in Egypt and Qusay in Tunisia? And the second question about what do you think about the roles of the NGOs and civil society could participate to develop or establish democracy in the African societies? Thank you.
Great. So thinking questions. Who would like to begin?
Okay. So we are used to play together as a team, so we share the book. So I would start with the question of what we can do about when there is an attempt to manipulate the constitutions. In Senegal, we had a solution that was effective. In 2016, after the referendum, they decided that the Republican nature of the Senegalese government is what they call intangible, so you can't change it. And there is a clause in the constitution that is called the clause of eternity. Mm-hmm. So it means that we choose disposition in the constitution and we say these dispositions can't be changed by a referendum. Mm-hmm. So the number of the mandate, the duration, and the Republican nature of the Senegalese government are intangible. And it saves us during this crisis. When the president issues a law to extend his own term, the constitutional court say, by extending your own term, you're touching to the intangibility of the duration of the term. So it means that finding in the constitution what is really important to be left and to be safeguarded and to be, intangible. It's a way of prohibiting all the change they do. So when they want to stay, no longer they extend. They just make a fake referendum, extra, or issue a law at the parliament. So the clause of eternity or intangibility is I think, a solution that can be taken. And just so to draw on your question, you're right. In Senegal, we were looking at what was happening to Donald Trump with his judiciary affair here in the US, but it was interesting for us because at the same time Sonko was imprisoned, and we were saying, oh, look, in the US, even though there are cases against Trump, but the judicial system is letting him be able to run. And and we were interested in that question, but you're right to highlight the point that there is two faces, and sometimes the judicial can play a non-democratic role. Yeah. But in the specific case of Senegal, unfortunately, they play a role that was enhancing democracy. Mm-hmm. So, just one word around decolonization, dictatorship, and corruption. But I want to just blend the question with the question you asked about Mali, and I will let Achille go. Most of the time, there is a fake trade-off that the military regime or dictatorship proposed to societies between security and freedom. And it's not true. Even though during the COVID-19, it was the occasion for all the regime to reinforce through biopolitics, the control of the society by saying, okay, we need to reinforce your security, but we need to take on your rights, on your liberty. And I think it's a tendency. Yesterday we had a workshop in Durham, and we had a scholar that was reflecting on the military regime in Mali, and he told us a lot of things. He reflected on the military imaginaries that were here since the independence in Mali, because they had several military coups, and probably when the military coups are a tradition in a country, it's bring a kind of imaginaries. But also he was highlighting, he was reflecting on the discourse of the military regime, and a lot of interesting things, but one thing that interests me is that probably in the time, the efficiency of that ideological discourse will be just erased by the reality of the regime, because those regimes are more and more autocratic. And I think the promise they give at the first day of freedom, the population and the society will end up seeing that behind their rhetoric and argument, they are not solving the issue of security, but at the same time, they are implementing an authoritarian regime. And I hope that the society will turn not buying those discourse around security that necessitates a control, but just facing the reality of the regime. But now it's history. We don't know when it will arrive, but I have a lot of friends from Mali who are not buying anymore the discourse, and I know a lot of people that are actually moving in different countries because they are looking with clarity in the real nature of that regime beyond the discourse of that regime. But it's a very complicated situation, and I'm sure that it's not easy to transfer from a place what happens to another place, because there's a historical trend and a specificity in a specific area. But I think those regimes will end up, being just pushed away. I'm sure in the time. I don't know when and how, but I'm sure it's a process.
Yeah.
La technologie.
La technology. Okay. On technology, I mean, that's a big.
2 minutes.
Yes, it's huge. Maybe just two quick remarks. One very practical. Little of what I see on the ground in the continent is that there is a huge appetite for technology, and we can't really dismiss it just like that. We have to definitely try to understand what is at the origin of that appetite for tools. And the types of cultural understandings of tools that these societies have developed over time. There are a number of studies on that can help in assessing this. So there's a huge appetite for contemporary technologies. Second, the ways in which contemporary technologies of calculation in particular operate speaks a lot to pre-colonial ways in which in African systems of thought the world was conceived of, the relations between human beings and things was crafted. You see, when you read a book like Amos Tutuola's novel,
The Drink Wine of Palm.
Yes.
Palm Drink Wine.
The Palm Wine Drinker.
Wine Drink.
You read a book like that. It's a book that could have been, you can say it's somewhat of a prefiguration of algorithmic reason. So there's something, what I mean is that there's something in the cultural practices historically situated of African societies that predisposes them to easily embrace the technological. And we witness it, including with contemporary technologies. This doesn't mean that the critique of technology shouldn't be done. And in that sense, of course, Heidegger's concerning technology is important, but we have to move beyond that. We have to do this taking seriously the fact that the kind of technological escalation the world has been going through over the last quarter of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st is completely unprecedented and is erasing somewhat most of the foundational anthropological boundaries we have established for so long, and paving the way for new forms of life, which themselves are in need not only of thorough description, but also interpretation. All of that having been said, I mean, that's the intellectual part of it. The practical part is that, of course, there is no technological solutionism. people really are looking for what is efficient, what serves them.
That's right.
If it serves them, they adhere to it. If it doesn't, they discard it, which has somewhat been a key way of operating in African societies. I mean, you decommission gods, you decommission religions, all that doesn't work, you put it aside, recycle it if necessary, and move on. So it seems to me, I mean, we have to be attentive to these dynamics if we want to articulate a proper critique of the technological in our times.
I think that's a great response. We have talked about so much, and I want to thank both of you for being here with us here at UVA, Achille Mbembe and Felwine Sarr, and thank you all for coming today. Let's give everyone a round of applause.